How well will vaccines work?
They will not simply eradicate COVID-19.
Governments need to start thinking about how to live with the virus.
Even miracles have their limits.
Even miracles have their limits.
Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner
Vaccines against the coronavirus have arrived sooner
and worked better than many people dared hope.
and worked better than many people dared hope.
Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives.
Without them, the pandemic threatened to take more than 150 million lives.
And yet, while the world rolls up a sleeve,
And yet, while the world rolls up a sleeve,
it has become clear that expecting vaccines to see off COVID-19 is mistaken.
it has become clear that expecting the vaccines to see off the virus is
Instead,
mistaken.
the disease will circulate for years
Instead, the disease will circulate for years
and seems likely to become endemic.
and seems likely to become endemic.
When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise.
When COVID-19 first struck, governments were caught by surprise.
Now they need to think ahead.
Now they need to think ahead.
To call vaccination a miracle is no exaggeration.
To call the vaccine a miracle is no exaggeration.
A little more than a year after the virus was first recognized,
A little more than a year after the virus was first recognized,
medics have already administered 148 million doses.
medics have already administered 148 million doses.
In Israel, the world's champion inoculator, hospital admissions among those aged below 60
Hospital admissions among those aged below 60
who have not received a jab are higher than ever.
who have not received a jab are higher than ever.
By contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s,
By contrast, among the largely inoculated over
nearly 40%.
by contrast,
Inoculated. By contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s,
by contrast, among the largely inoculated over 60s,
they are already nearly 40% below their mid-January peak.
They are already 40% below their mid-January peak,
and they will fall further.
And they will fall further.
Although vaccines failed to prevent all mild and asymptomatic cases of COVID-19,
Although vaccines fail to prevent all mild and asymptomatic cases of COVID-19,
they mostly seem to spare patients from death.
They mostly seem to spare patients from death
and the severest infections that require hospital admission.
And the severest infections that require hospital admission.
Which is what really matters.
Which is what really matters.
Early evidence suggests that some vaccines stop the virus spreading too.
Early evidence suggests that some viruses early vaccines stop the virus spreading too.
This would greatly slow the pandemic.
And
thus make it easier to alleviate lockdowns. Without causing a surge of cases.
Without causing a surge of
cases. Without causing a surge of cases.
Without causing a surge of cases.
That overwhelms intensive care units. Those findings and many more will harden up.
Those findings and many more will harden up.
over the next few months as more data emerge.
over the next few months as more data emerge.
However, despite all this good news,
And yet, despite all this good news,
the coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet.
the coronavirus is not finished with humanity yet.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
COVID-19 will continue to circulate widely.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
There is a greater realization that the virus is likely to find permanent home in humans. Home in humans.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
There is a growing realization that the virus is likely to find a permanent home in humans.
As The Jab, our new podcast, which launches on February 15th, will explore.
As The Jab, a new podcast, launched on February 15th, will explore.
That has profound implications for how governments need to respond.
That has profound implications for how governments will respond.
One reason the coronavirus will persist
is that making and distributing enough vaccines
the world's 7.8 billion people
to protect the world's 7.8 billion people
is a Herculean task. Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
Even Britain, which is vaccinating the population at a faster rate than any other big country,
will not finish with the over 50s until May.
Will not finish with the over 50s until May.
To add to the burden, the potency of a jab may fade.
To add to the burden, the potency of the jab may fade.
Making boosters necessary.
Making boosters necessary.
Outside the rich world, 85% of countries
Outside the rich world, 85% of the countries
have yet to start their vaccination programs. Until the billions of people who live in them have felt the prick of a needle, which may not be before 2023, they will remain fuel for the virus.
They'll remain fuel for the virus.
Another reason for COVID-19's persistence
is that
even as vaccines are making SARS-CoV-2 less infectious,
even as vaccines make the SARS-CoV-2 less infectious
and protecting people against death,
and protecting people against death,
new viral variants are undoing some of their good work.
New variants are undoing some of their good work.
For one thing, successful variants are more infectious.
Successful variants are more infectious.
Anything from 25 to 40% in the case of B117.
Anything from 25 to 40% in case of B117,
which was first found in Britain. Infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth.
Infection
is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth.
The infection is governed by the dizzying mathematics of exponential growth.
So cases and deaths accumulate rapidly. even if the variant is no more deadly.
even if the variant is no more deadly.
To get a given level of viral suppression,
To get a given level of viral suppression,
more onerous social distancing is needed.
more onerous social distancing is needed.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
In addition, new variants may withstand current vaccines.
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
The ones found in Brazil and South Africa
may also be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
may defeat the immunity acquired by a previous vaccine.
COVID-19 infection may be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous COVID-19 infection.
Will be defeating the immunity acquired from a previous
COVID-19 infection.
COVID-19 infection.
The hope is that such cases will be milder.
The hope is that such cases will be milder
because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
because the immune system has been primed by the first encounter with the disease.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Even if that is true, the virus will continue to circulate.
Finding unprotected people, and because this is what viruses do,
Finding unprotected people, and because that's what viruses do,
evolving new strains,
evolving new strains,
some of which will be better at evading the defenses that societies have mounted against them.
some of which will be better at evading the protections that societies have mounted.
And the third reason SARS-CoV-2 will persist.
And the third reason that SARS-CoV-2 will persist
is that lots of people will choose to remain a target.
Is that lots of people will choose to remain a target
by refusing vaccination.
By refusing vaccination.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease.
A total of 10 million Britons are vulnerable to the disease
because of their age or underlying conditions.
Because of their age and their underlying conditions.
Modeling suggests that if just 10% of them
Modeling suggests that if just 10% of them
declined to be vaccinated, if social distancing were abandoned while the virus was still liable to circulate at high levels,
and if the social distancing is while the virus is liable to circulate and if social distancing were abandoned while the virus is liable to circulate at high levels,
then a tremendous spike in infections and deaths would result.
Then the tremendous spikes in infections and deaths will result.
In reality, the share of the overall population that remains unvaccinated
In reality, the share of the population that remain vulnerable to the virus
is likely to be much higher than in that thought experiment.
Is likely to remain much higher than in the thought experiment.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Vaccines are not yet licensed for children.
Minority communities in many countries, which are most vulnerable to infection,
Minority communities, which are most vulnerable to the virus,
tend to have less trust in the government and the medical establishment.
Tend to have less trust in the government and the medical establishment.
Even among some care workers, As many as half refuse vaccination.
Even among healthcare workers, as many as half refuse vaccination.
Despite having seen the ravages of COVID 19 at first hand.
Despite having seen the ravages of the COVID-19 at first hand.
With the new variants, about 80% of the overall population
With the new variant, about 80% of the population
needs to be immune for an infected person on average
needs to be immune for an infected person on average
to pass on the disease to less than one contact.
to pass on the disease to less than one contact.
The threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
The threshold at which the epidemic subsides.
That will be a tall order.
That will be a tall order.
For all these reasons, governments need to start planning for COVID 19
For all these reasons, the government will need to start planning for COVID 19 as an endemic disease.
Today, they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
Today, they treat it as an emergency that will pass.
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
To see how those ways of thinking differ,
consider New Zealand, which has sought to be COVID free,
consider New Zealand, which has sought to be, which is thought to
by
be,
bolting its
which has sought to be COVID free
claws against the world.
by bolting doors against the world.
In this way, it has kept registered deaths down to just 25.
In this case, it has kept the registered deaths down to 25.
But such a draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense.
But such a draconian policy makes no sense as a permanent defense.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
New Zealand is not North Korea.
As vulnerable Kiwis are vaccinated,
their
country will come under growing pressure to open its borders.
The country will come under great pressure to open its borders.
And hence to start to tolerate endemic COVID 19 infections and deaths.
And hence to tolerate endemic COVID-19 infections and deaths.
Across the world, governments will have to work out
Across the world, governments will have to work out
when and how to switch from emergency measures
when and how to switch from an emergency measure
to policies that are economically and socially sustainable indefinitely.
to policies that are socially and economically sustainable indefinitely.
The transition will be politically hard.
The transition will be politically hard.
In places that have invested a lot in being COVID free,
In places that have invested a lot in being COVID free.
Nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
Nowhere more so than China, where vaccination is slow.
The Communist Party has defined every case of COVID 19 as unacceptable.
The Communist Party has defined any cases of COVID-19 as unacceptable.
Wide circulation of the disease as a sign of the decadence of Western democracies.
And wide circulation of the disease as the Western society's decadence. The decadence of Western societies.
To living with COVID-19.
The adjustment to living with COVID-19
begins with medical science. Work has already started on tweaking vaccines. To confer protection against variants. That should go along with more surveillance of mutations that are spreading. And accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
and accelerated regulatory approval for booster shots.
Meanwhile, treatments will be required to save more of those
Meantime, treatments are required to save more of them.
the disease. More of those.
More of those. In the meantime, the treatment is required to save more of them.
To contract the disease from death or serious illness.
Who contract the disease from death or serious illness.
The best outcome would be for a combination of acquired immunity.
The best outcome will be a combination of acquired immunity, regular booster jobs of tweaked vaccines,
and a menu of therapies to ensure that COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
And a menu of therapies to ensure that the COVID-19 need rarely be life-threatening.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
But that outcome is not guaranteed.
To the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
to the extent that medicine cannot alone
lethal outbreaks of to the extent that medicine alone cannot prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
to the extent that medicine cannot alone
prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
to the extent that medicine cannot alone prevent lethal outbreaks of COVID-19,
the burden will also fall on behavior.
The burden will also fall on behavior.
Just as it has in most of the pandemic.
Just it has in most of the pandemic.
But rather than national lockdowns and months-long school closures, which come at a huge price, the responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
The responsibility should fall more heavily on individuals.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Habits like mask wearing may become part of everyday life.
Vaccine passports and restrictions in crowded spaces could become mandatory.
Vaccine passports and restriction in crowded places could become mandatory.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Vulnerable people will have to maintain great vigilance.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education.
Those who refuse vaccination can expect health education
and encouragement, but limited protection.
And encouragement, but limited protection.
As our special report on the travel industry makes clear,
people's
desire to live their lives will ultimately be hard to resist.
People's desire to live their life will ultimately be hard to resist.
Even in autocracies like China that may be reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
Even in countries like China that are reluctant to leave zero tolerance behind.
The persistence of acute infections and chronic debilitating long COVID.
The persistence of acute infection and long debilitating COVID-19
means that the next stage of the pandemic sounds grim. But even if COVID-19 has not been completely put to rest,
but even the COVID-19 has not yet been completely put to rest,
the situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
The situation is immeasurably better than what might have been.
The credit for that goes to medical science.
The credit for that goes to medical science.